today we're going to have two speakers as well as a representative from the Social Justice Hub, and we're going to be talking about the bail fund in Madison and prison abolition, as well as human rights work in connection to food. We also have a couple.
Do you want to talk about all the upcoming events that we have this week?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have some more events coming up for Human Rights Week. Tomorrow we have a demo kitchen and a chocolate workshop, and then on Friday the chocolate workshop's also on Friday.
Yeah, chocolate workshop's on Friday. Tomorrow's sushi workshop.
Yeah, tomorrow's the sushi workshop, and then we also have a Free Art Friday as well. And you can, if you have any more questions about the event, you can come up to me or another one of the board members after this event, or you can check us out on the website as well. Thank you. You can, Liam, you can start off.
Okay, bet. Hey everybody, how you doing today?
Doing well.
All right. My name is Liam Monhome, aka Lil Guillotine. I'm a hip hop artist. That's why I kind of did that like that. Anyways, I'm a stay-at-home father, a hip hop artist, community organizer, member of the Industrial Workers of the World. It's on my head, IWW. Mechanical engineer. Got my degree here at UW. Master plumber, formerly incarcerated person, and I also helped start the Free the 350 Bail Fund in Madison here. Funny story actually, the path that led me to start performing hip hop was through a fundraising event with the Bail Fund. So basically the Madison hip hop community stepped up in a major way to support the cause of freeing people, but there were no artists who had songs specifically about prison abolition. So I stepped up to meet the challenge and have been doing hip hop ever since. And thanks to the Wisconsin Union Directorate Cuisine Committee, or WUD Cuisine, for having us to talk about the bail fund, the prison system, prison abolition, and how it ties in with food sovereignty during this Human Rights Month, I thought it was, or is it just a week?
A week.
It's a week, okay, my bad. I want to start off by talking a little about the situation in Dane County jails and jails across the whole country and how they constitute a human rights crisis, basically. Then I want to talk a little about prison abolition as the overarching goal of the work that we do in the bail fund, and then end shortly on how food sovereignty plays into the problem and can help with the cause. So the situation in Dane County jails and incarceration as a human rights crisis first. So the prison and the jail system in the U.S. very much constitutes a human rights crisis. Data that the sentencingproject.org has compiled shows that we lead the world in incarceration of our citizens by a big margin. We imprison 655 out of every 100,000 citizens here in the United States, and we have 2.2 million people who are in prison currently. Human Rights Watch notes that African Americans are incarcerated at a rate that's 6 times white folks for drug offenses, despite the fact that both use drugs at similar rates. There is consistently disproportionate sentencing given for black folks compared to white folks, as Michelle Alexander points out in her groundbreaking investigative journalist piece, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Definitely a book folks should check out if you haven't already. One of our members in the bail fund, Talib Akbar, spent a number of months in solitary confinement in Wisconsin prisons, or as the state likes to call it, in my opinion, an Orwellian double-speak gesture meant to obscure the inhumanity of the practice, security housing units, when in fact we're talking about solitary confinement. Or the SHOE, which is an acronym you may have heard on the popular Netflix series Orange is the New Black. Now that he's out of prison, he organizes against prisons through an organization called EXPO, or Ex-Incarcerated People Organizing, also another organization called Moses, and through the bail fund with us. So he constructed a mock solitary confinement cell in the back of a utility truck, and he goes around and gives presentations about the inhumane and psychologically torturous nature of solitary confinement. And he uses the mock solitary cell as a teaching tool. He'll be bringing it to the fundraiser, the faux fundraiser that Tommy has organized next week at the Social Justice Center. He'll be talking about more. And also, according to Amnesty International, the U.S. has become the world leader in the practice of solitary confinement, holding people in inhumane conditions of isolation from Arizona to Illinois to Louisiana and to Guantanamo. And reportedly, the U.S. holds at least 25,000 inmates in isolation in supermax prisons alone. The United Nations has multiple times recognized the U.S.'s use of solitary confinement as a human rights crisis. A United Nations expert on torture called on all countries to ban the solitary confinement of prisoners except in very exceptional circumstances and for as short as time as possible, with an absolute prohibition in the case of juveniles and people with mental disabilities. But yet, there are over 5,000 children in jails and prisons in the United States, and there are currently more people with mental and emotional disorders in jails and prisons here than there are in mental institutions here. So, like during our work in the jails here in Dane County, we've personally seen youth in Dane County Jail placed, well, number one, in adult jails with the adults, and then number two, in solitary confinement, allegedly for their own safety. And we tend to prioritize those folks if we ever see them or come across those folks. And we've also seen folks who are transgendered placed in solitary confinement, also for their own safety. We've also seen at least one person who has died in the jail here, and that's just in the 2 years that we've been operating, allegedly for medical complications. But it's unclear whether that person would have died had they not been in jail, or whether there was any neglect at play due to the consistent propensity of law enforcement to conduct their own investigations on themselves. And so while I'm talking about the human rights abuses of the prison industrial complex right here in Madison, I should talk a little bit more about our bail fund, the Free the 350 bail fund. So yeah, first off, I should explain where the name comes from, right? So it has to do with the percentage of folks who are black in Madison, which is 6%, while the percentage of folks who are white in Madison is 79%. But meanwhile, according to the Justice Policy Institute, black folks in Madison are sent to prison for drugs at a rate 97 times their white counterparts. And black folks in Madison are arrested in general, according to the Race to Equity report, at a rate almost 11 times that of white folks here. So these policing disparities have resulted in the jail population obviously to be disproportionately black folks, so much so that the county would need to free 350 black folks to make the ratio of black to white people incarcerated in there reflect the ratio of the population of Madison, thus free the 350. And so this term dates back to 2015. This was a term coined by the Young, Gifted, and Black Coalition, as well as Freedom Inc., which are two organizations that work towards black liberation here in town, both great organizations. Young, Gifted, and Black doesn't really operate as much anymore, but Freedom Inc. is very much doing stuff, great things in the community. They're also involved in the bail fund. About 2 years ago, a group of folks from the community who have been working to stop the construction of a new jail from the grassroots, we decided to form a bail fund to free folks from the Dane County Jail who were in there simply because they couldn't afford bail. We prioritize black folks, particularly black youth, trans folks, and black mothers. So a little bit about like prison abolition in our bail fund work and how they're like related. So we bail folks out of jail because, well, it's the right thing to do, but also as a part of a broader framework of abolitionist political aims. We're an abolitionist bail fund. putting people inside of the racist debtor's jail that is the Dane County Jail is inhumane, but also it's unconstitutional to hold them simply because they can't afford bail, right? Because in 1970, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in a case called Williams versus Illinois that extending a maximum prison term because a person is too poor to pay fines or court costs violates the right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And there were similar Supreme Court rulings that were made in 1971 in Tate versus Short, and again in 1983 in Bearden versus Georgia. But yet, the debtor's prison remains a common thing in the American criminal justice landscape today. One of our larger goals in the bail fund is that we would like to end the money bail system, because we've seen over and over that it targets folks who are poor disproportionately. This is a movement that's gaining momentum across the country. So you see folks working to end money bail in many different places, New York, Illinois, California, as well as many other states. Another large and much more longer term goal that we have is to abolish prisons outright, as we see them as symptoms of a racist, classist, unequal society, as opposed to a legitimate means in which to curb or stop crime. A major tactic that we employ during our bail fund operations as a way to meet our goal is to build a grassroots, community-oriented political base off of which to achieve our political aims, a base of folks in the community who are sick of the racist criminal justice system, of folks who help us by contributing to our cause, and folks who are formerly incarcerated and their family and friends. And talking about prison abolition, I'm sure that might bring up much larger questions around it and its efficacy, as well as what would the alternatives to prisons and jails be. So I'm gonna go into that a little bit. Part of the reason that those questions arise is because the prison and jail system is so firmly entrenched in the public and private spheres of society as a legitimate institution to deal with crime that we have no ability to imagine an alternative, right? And this was not always the case. As Angela Davis points out in her groundbreaking critical abolitionist theoretical work from 2004, Are Prisons Obsolete? Which, by the way, I recorded an audiobook version of Are Prisons Obsolete, and it's available on my YouTube channel, Lil Guillotine, and also on my podcast RSS feed, the Lil Guillotine Podcast, which you can find almost anywhere podcasts are found, as well as my website, lilguillotine.com. Plug it. There was a time in the Angela Davis said, there was a time in the late 60s, in the early 70s, when prison populations were actually dwindling, and it was obvious that prisons simply do not work, and it seemed that the prison would no longer exist as a legitimate means to deal with crime. And Angela Davis, in her book, of People, occurred in the 1980s during what is known as the Reagan era. Politicians argued that tough on crime stances, including certain imprisonment and longer sentences, would keep communities free of crime. However, the practice of mass incarceration during that period had little or no effect on official crime rates. In fact, the most obvious pattern was that larger prison populations led not to safer communities, but rather to even larger prison populations, right? So, according to Scientific American, a journal, there was a study that found that sentencing someone to prison had no effect on their chances of being convicted of a violent crime within 5 years of being released from prison. This means that prison has no preventative effect on violence in the long term among people who might have been sentenced to probation, and that there are also good reasons to believe that prisons might actually increase crime. So Angela Davis in her book also points out that creating agendas of decarceration and broadly casting the net of alternatives helps us to do the ideological work of pulling apart the conceptual link between crime and punishment. This more nuanced understanding of the social rule of the punishment system requires us to give up our usual way of thinking about punishment as an inevitable consequence of crime. We would recognize that punishment does not follow from crime in the neat and logical sequence offered by discourses that insist on the justice of imprisonment, but rather punishment, primarily through imprisonment and sometimes death, is linked to the agendas of politicians, the profit drive of corporations, and media representations of crime. And Arthur Waskow from the Institute for Policy Studies succinctly, in my opinion, stated, "Forget about reform. It's time to talk about abolishing jails and prisons in American society." Still though, abolition? Where do you put the prisoners, the criminals? What's the alternative? First, having no alternative at all would create less crime than the present criminal training centers do. Second, the only full alternative is building the kind of society that does not need prisons, a decent redistribution of power and income so as to put out the hidden fire of burning envy that now flames up in crimes of property, both burglary by the poor and embezzlement by the affluent, and a decent sense of community that can support, reintegrate, and truly rehabilitate those who suddenly become filled with fury or despair, and that can face them not as objects, as criminals, but as people who have committed illegal acts, as have almost all of us, right? Okay, so shortly talk about how food justice is related and can help with the cause. So just want to relay a little anecdote about my experience. I was raised in extreme poverty by a single mother with 5 siblings. There were multiple times when we did not have any food, nor did we know where our next meal was coming from. And I remember one time we were outside of a grocery store on East Washington Avenue, Kohl's. It's a old chain that used to be around, and we had no money for food. I think we had to wait a few hours, and then we were gonna go pick up a voucher for food from our church. And I remember being so starving outside of that grocery store that we resorted to eating ants off the ground. I think I was like 6 years old at the time. I bring up this anecdote because it's a stark comparison of a poor child having to resort to eating ants off the ground outside of a grocery store with an abundance of food, much of which was being thrown away for profit, that was owned by a multimillionaire family, by the way. It's the Herb Kohl family, who also owned the Kohl's clothing stores. They used to own the grocery stores as well. Later, we resorted to stealing food from that store instead of starving, a decision that was common sense to someone in my position. And indeed, I got caught and got in trouble with the police multiple times for stealing food when I was starving as a child. And so financial inequality leads to crimes of private property. As long as one doesn't have enough to eat, one will be forced to steal in order to survive. So Emma Goldman, the anarchist community organizer, feminist, and participant in the Russian Revolution, said, "Ask for work. If they don't give you work, ask for bread. If they do not give you work or bread, then take bread." Right? And Russian revolutionary Peter Kropotkin theorized about mutual aid as a revolutionary act, and also like feeding each other as well as part of mutual aid. And the feminist theoretician Sylvia Federici talks about the need to reclaim the commons as a way to resist capitalism, and it's because it has a need to commodify and make private that which used to be in the public domain, including access to fresh, healthy food. So I think that the capitalist state understands these concepts too well, if not implicitly, And that is why like organizations like Food Not Bombs were continuously targeted by the police for their work. Food Not Bombs, by the way, is an organization that started in, I believe, San Francisco, and they feed people, right, as part of like revolutionary praxis, if you didn't know that. We don't really have one in Madison since the 90s. Also, the Black Panthers, right, caught the repressive attention of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI when they started to feed the children. They had a Feed the Children program. And coincidentally, the young, skilled orator and community organizer, Fred Hampton, from the Chicago branch of the Black Panthers, was assassinated by Chicago police today, December 4th, in 1969, through J. Edgar Hoover, FBI's COINTELPRO operation. So we understand these concepts in the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, and that's why we hold a free meal every other Saturday on the top of State Street to feed folks, to take back the commons, to build base, political base, and to provide basic needs for people so they aren't forced to steal to survive and risk ending up in jail. So yeah, just real quick, I got a song that I did. It's called Thirst, Eat the Rich. Oh yeah, I got it mentioned in Teen Vogue last week, by the way. So that's pretty cool. So anyways, I just want to do like an a cappella version. Maybe I'll do spoken word. So here it goes. It goes, eat the rich and stay fresh. We be munching on flesh. Fee for brunching it when. P, both starving and then. You funnel food in the trash can for profit. We had enough and we here to stop it. 1 out of 6 in the country is hungry. 1 out of 5 children have empty tummies. 1 out of 1 of the rich is the villain. 100% of the rich need killing. We stop it with force cause of course they got muscle. We eat the rich cause they keeping us hustled. Delete police, but don't forget truffles. Popo risotto with honey and waffles. Feed us the dream as we starve in the street. They judge the hungry folks that they meet. Blinded by personal responsibility. Puritan work ethic splits the community. We topple facade and we call for unity. Model discreet, cause this here's a mutiny. Chuck 40% of food with impunity. Guillotine and your neck meets beautifully. Eat the rich and stay fresh. We be munching on flesh. Fee for bunching it when. P, both starving and then. You funnel food in a trash can for profit. We had enough and we here to stop it. We snack on backs of oppressors. Yes, sir. You bet we best not cause nutrient stressors. Eat the rich, make the dish healthily. Prepared flesh, fried it with fresh butter. Cultured seed, pastured batch. Gourmet cooking, cause we enjoy life. More stay full when got nutrients right. Fine dining should be ubiquitous. Not crime when you eat on how boost flesh. Grass fed to keep the nutrients tight. Serve bread, grain fresh for harvest supply. Reduced, simmer braised, and wine all night. We choose dinner raised in fine halls in white. Buy food processed regimes. Why? Do all that we need fresh. Fuck markets, take it, bet. We truck out the takings, fuck. Waiting for overthrows, we out here making it eat. The rich and stay fresh, we be munching on flesh. Fee for bunching it when. P, both starving and then. You funnel food in a trash can for profit. We had enough and we here to stop it. So yeah, that's my song. So just real quick, like moving forward, some things to get involved with food sovereignty and prison abolition and the bail fund. Freedom Inc. and Freedom Youth Squads got a No Cops in Schools campaign. They're continuously showing up to the Department of Education's board meetings and demanding that they get the cops out of schools, which is an important part of abolition. Obviously, Tommy's fundraiser is next week, Friday. We can be talking about it more. Tomorrow, 9:30 a.m., you can meet at the Taco Bell in East Washington. We're gonna go with Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee to the Department of Corrections Committee on Inmate and Youth Deaths and try to basically work towards curbing the deaths in the Wisconsin prisons And then we're gonna be working on stopping the construction of the new jail in Madison soon, so look out for that. Cause just like I explained, we feel like jails are not part of the solution. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.